My therapist spent 6 months teaching me how to say no to my toxic ex. Today, it finally worked. I ended things for good and blocked her number. But what I couldn't tell my ex, what I couldn't tell anyone, was the real reason I suddenly wanted to clear my schedule. It wasn't about healing. It was about the text message I was currently drafting. To my therapist. The first time Nora Chen walked into Dr. Vivienne Hart's office, she was 26 minutes early, holding a half-empty coffee she no longer wanted, and still wearing the same jeans she had worn to her ex-girlfriend's apartment the night before. She had not planned to cry in the waiting room. She had planned to be composed, maybe even a little detached, the kind of person who said, "I'm just here to get some tools," and then left. But the intake form asked for reason for seeking therapy, and Nora stared at the blank line for so long that her vision blurred, and then the blur turned into actual tears, and before she knew it, she was crying into the shoulder of a receptionist named Brenda, who smelled like vanilla hand sanitizer and had very strong opinions about emotional wellness. "Sweetheart," Brenda said, patting her back with a rhythm that was almost parental, "you are in the right place. Dr. Hart has seen everything, literally everything. One time a man came in wearing a full dinosaur costume and she didn't even blink." Nora laughed witty. "That's not comforting." "It's a little comforting," Brenda said. The office was in a converted brownstone in the West Village, all warm wood and soft lighting, the kind of space that cost more per hour than Nora made in a full shift at the bookstore. She had found Dr. Hart's name through a friend of a friend who said, "She's tough but fair, and she won't let you wallow." Nora had liked that. She had been wallowing for 11 months ever since Maya had left, and she was tired of it. The door to the inner office opened, and Nora looked up. Dr. Vivienne Hart was not what she expected. She was tall, for one thing, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a low bun, and the kind of tailored blazer that suggested she had never once owned a pair of sweatpants. Her face was sharp and elegant, her posture immaculate, and her eyes were a cool, pale gray that seemed to take in everything at once. She looked like she had been carved out of marble and then dressed by a very expensive personal stylist. She also looked, Laura thought with a small, hysterical internal laugh, exactly like the kind of woman Meyer would have called intimidatingly hot, before immediately trying to impress her. "Ms. Chen," Dr. Hart said, and her voice was low and even, with no particular warmth but also no coldness. "I'm Dr. Hart. Please come in." Nora stood up, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and followed her into the office. The therapy room was quieter than the waiting area, with a large window overlooking a small garden and 2 armchairs facing each other at a comfortable distance. There was no couch. Nora had always imagined a couch, but she supposed that was a stereotype. Dr. Hart settled into one of the chairs and gestured to the other. "Take your time," she said. "There's no rush." Nora sat down, clutching her coffee cup like a lifeline. "Sorry I'm early, and sorry I was crying in your waiting room. I wasn't planning on, I don't usually do that." "You don't need to apologize for having feelings in a therapist's office," Dr. Hart said. "That's rather the point of coming here." "Right, yeah." Nora took a breath. "Okay. So, my ex-girlfriend Maya, we broke up 11 months ago, and I'm still not over her. My friends are tired of hearing about it. My sister told me to just get over it already. And my therapist, my previous one, she told me I needed to set boundaries with Maya, because we still talked all the time, and I still go over to her apartment when she calls, and I still answer every text. But I don't know how to set boundaries. I don't even know what that looks like." She paused, aware that she was rambling. Dr. Hart's expression had not changed. She was listening, though, with an attention that felt almost physical, like a spotlight being slowly adjusted. "So I guess I'm here because I need someone to tell me what to do," Nora finished, "because clearly I can't figure it out on my own." Dr. Hart was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can I ask what you're hoping to feel once you've set these boundaries?" Nora blinked. "I don't know. Freedom? Relief? Maybe just not wanting to cry every time I see her car parked down the street." "And what do you think Maya will feel when you start setting them?" The question caught Nora off guard. I don't know, maybe hurt? She's used to me being available." "And how does that make you feel? the thought of her being hurt. Nora's throat tightened. Terrible, like I'm the one doing something wrong. Dr. Hart nodded slowly, and for the first time, something shifted in her face, a faint, almost imperceptible softening around the eyes. "Nora," she said, "I think we're going to have to talk about why you're so afraid of being the one who walks away. But not today. Today, I just want you to know that this office is a safe place to feel everything you've been holding in, however long that takes." Nora stared at her, and something in her chest loosened, just a little, like a knot that had been pulled tight for months finally giving one small, tentative inch. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay." She did not know, then, that this woman would become the most important person in her life, or that the boundaries she was about to learn would not be the ones she expected. All she knew was that for the first time in 11 months, someone had looked at her and not asked her to hurry up and heal. Outside, the city hummed on. Inside, the clock on the mantel ticked softly, and Nora let herself breathe. The next morning, Nora woke up to a text from Maya. It was 7:42, and the message had been sent at 6:15. A screenshot of a meme about houseplants, followed by a single line. "Saw this and thought of you. Hope you slept okay." Nora lay in bed, staring at the screen. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard. She could already feel the familiar pull, the urge to respond immediately to prove she was still person Maya could count on. It was the same pull that had kept her answering calls at midnight for 11 months. She typed, "You too." Then she deleted it. She typed, "That's funny," and deleted that too. Finally, she just put the phone face down on her nightstand and went to take a shower. The shower helped, so did the coffee, and the walk to the bookstore, and the familiar smell of paper and dust when she unlocked the front door. She worked at Whitmore Books, a small independent shop in the East Village that smelled like old pages in someone's grandmother's attic. Her boss, a retired English teacher named Frank, was already in the back room with a box of new arrivals. "You're early," he called out, not looking up. "That's a first." "I'm turning over a new leaf," Nora said, and it came out flatter than she expected. Frank appeared in the doorway with a raised eyebrow. He was 63, had a beard that made him look like a gentle sea captain, and possessed an uncanny ability to know when something was wrong. He sat at her for a moment, then said, "New leaf, huh? Does this leaf have anything to do with why you've been looking like a ghost for the past year?" Nora laughed, surprising herself. "I started seeing a therapist yesterday." "Good," Frank said simply. "About damn time." He disappeared back into the stockroom, and that was that. No follow-up questions, no probing, just the quiet acceptance of a man who had known her for 4 years and had learned to let her come to things in her own time. The morning passed in a steady rhythm of unpacking boxes and restocking shelves. Nora found herself thinking about Dr. Hart more than she should have. The silver hair, the calm, unhurried way she spoke, the fact that she hadn't looked at the clock once during their session. Even though Nora had been 26 minutes late. By noon, she had checked her phone 11 times. Maya hadn't texted again. That was somehow worse. She was shelving a stack of poetry collections when her phone buzzed again. Her heart did a stupid little jump, but it wasn't Maya. It was her sister, Rachel. "Did you go yesterday? How was it?" Nora typed back, "It was good. She's good, I think." Rachel, "That's a start. Dinner Sunday? You can tell me everything." Nora, "Deal." She put the phone away and tried to focus on the poetry books, but her mind kept drifting back to that meme Maya had sent. "Saw this and thought of you." It was so small, so seemingly innocent. That was the insidious thing about Maya's patterns. They were never dramatic. They were always just soft enough to make Nora feel like she was overreacting for needing space. At 5 o'clock, she closed the shop and walked home through the cooling evening air. She made herself dinner, watched half a show she wasn't really following, and went to bed early. She did not text Maya back. On Thursday, she sat in the waiting room again, 15 minutes early this time. Brenda, the receptionist, gave her a warm smile and said, "Dr. Hart is ready for you." And Nora walked into the office to find the therapist standing by the window, silver hair catching the late afternoon light. "You're on time today," Dr. Hart said, and there was the faintest hint of warmth in her voice, almost like a joke. "I'm trying to turn over a new leaf," Nora said, and this time it felt a little less flat. Good. Dr. Hart gestured to the armchair. Tell me about your week. Nora sat down, and for a moment she didn't know where to start. Then the words came out in a rush. About the meme, about not responding, about checking her phone 11 times. I cuss how stupid it felt to be this affected by a single text message. Dr. Hart listened without interrupting. When Nora finally ran out of breath, she leaned forward slightly, hands folded in her lap. You didn't respond, she said. That's new. I mean, it's been 3 days. She probably thinks I'm mad at her. Are you? Nora opened her mouth, then closed it. I don't know, she admitted. I don't know what I am. That's okay, Dr. Hart said. You don't have to know yet. You just have to be willing to find out. She paused, and for a second her gaze softened, just a fraction, like a crack in a perfectly smooth surface. You did good this week, Nora. You held your ground without even knowing you were doing it. Nora felt something warm bloom in her chest, and she didn't know why. It was just a compliment. It was just her therapist being professional. But it felt like being seen, really, seen for the first time in a long, long while. She walked out of the office that evening with a strange lightness in her step. She did not check her phone. She did not think about Maya. She only thought about the way Dr. Hart had said her name, and the small, quiet smile that had flickered at the corner of her mouth. The rest of the week passed in a blur of routine. Nora shelved books, recommended thrillers to customers who asked for romance, and ate lunch at her desk with a sandwich she barely remembered making. Frank noticed her quietness but said nothing, only sliding a second cookie onto her plate on Thursday afternoon, with a grunt that meant, "You look like you need this." She thought about Dr. Hart more than she should have. Not in a dramatic way, not with any kind of urgency, but in the small, creeping moments. When she was wiping down the counter, when she was walking home, when psychically plotted it. He was lying in bed, and her mind wandered to the therapy office instead of to Maya. She replayed the way Dr. Hart had said her name, the way her gaze had softened, just for a second, before settling back into calm professionalism. It was nothing. It was just a thing her therapist did. Nora told herself this. So many times that the words lost their shape, becoming a kind of background hum. And still, when Friday morning arrived, she found herself standing outside a small coffee shop near the therapy building, 10 minutes early for her session, with a cardboard cup in each hand. She had not planned this. That was the thing she kept repeating to herself as she walked up the stairs. She had simply stopped at the coffee shop because she was early and it was cold. And then she had ordered 2 coffees because one was for her, obviously, and the other was for Dr. Hart, because it would be weird to carry just 1 cup into a therapy session and not offer anything. That was the logic. It was flawless. Only when she reached the door did she hesitate. The coffee was getting cold. Dr. Hart probably had her own fancy espresso machine in there, something professional and efficient, the kind of machine that cost more than Nora's rent. She was about to dump the second cup in the trash when the door opened. Nora? Dr. Hart stood in the doorway, her silver hair caught in the morning light, a pair of reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked surprised, but not unpleasantly so. You're early. I brought you coffee, Nora blurted out, and immediately felt her face burn. I brought myself coffee, and then I thought, it's stupid. It's just coffee. You probably have your own. I don't, Dr. Hart said. She was smiling, a small, unexpected curve at the corner of Hakel.
Back now, Mythe. I usually wait until after my first session to get a cup. I'm still working on my morning fog. She stepped back, holding the door open. Come in. You can tell me why you felt the need to buy me a beverage. It was a question, but it didn't feel like an interrogation. It felt like an invitation. Nora stepped inside, clutching both cups, and set one on the small side table, next to the armchair she always sat in. She held the other out to Dr. Hart, who took it with both hands, cradling it like it was something precious. It's just coffee, Nora said again, but it came out weaker than she meant it to. It's not just coffee, Dr. Hart replied. And she didn't elaborate. She just sat down in her chair, opened the lid of the cup, and inhaled the steam. Her eyes closed for a moment, and something in her face loosened, a tension Nora hadn't even realized was there. Thank you, Nora. That was thoughtful. The The session was ordinary. They talked about Maya, about the silence that had stretched into a full week, about the text Nora still hadn't replied to, and the guilt that came with that. Dr. Hart asked questions, Nora answered them, and the hour passed the way hours in that room did, slow and fast at the same time, like being suspended in amber. But at the end, when Nora stood to leave, Dr. Hart did something she hadn't done before. She set down her coffee cup, walked to the door, and held it open for Nora. Her fingers brushed the edge of the door frame, and for a moment she looked like she wanted to say something more. Then she just smiled, that small, quiet smile that seemed to live at the corner of her mouth. "Same time next week?" Dr. Hart asked. "Same time," Nora said. She walked out into the hallway, and the door clicked shut behind her. It was only when she reached the bottom of the stairs that she realized she was smiling too. She did not think about Maya at all on the walk home. She thought about the way Dr. Hart had held the coffee cup with both hands, like she was warming herself with it. She thought about the word thoughtful, and how it had sounded like a compliment, and how she wanted to hear it again. It was just coffee, she told herself. It was just a therapist being professional, but somewhere deep in her chest, a small, stubborn voice whispered, "It wasn't just coffee, and you know it." She walked faster, as if she could outrun the thought. She couldn't. The message came on Friday night at 9:47 p.m. while Nora was folding laundry. "Maya, can we talk? I feel like we left things weird. I miss you." Nora stood in her tiny living room, a pair of socks in her hands, staring at the screen until the words blurred. A week of silence. She had almost gotten used to the quiet, almost convinced herself that the ache was fading. And now here it was again, warm and familiar, pulling at her like a tide. She sat down on the couch, her thumb hovered over the keyboard. She typed, deleted, typed again. "I miss you too." Is that what she wanted? Was it true? She put the phone face down on the armrest, picked it up again. Her heart was doing that thing it always did with Maya, that quick, panicked flutter that wanted to say yes to everything. But then, out of nowhere, she heard a voice in her head, quiet and even. It wasn't Dr. Hart's voice exactly. It was more like the feeling of sitting in that armchair, being asked questions she didn't want to answer. "What do you actually want, Nora?" She didn't know, but she knew she didn't want to answer tonight. She placed the phone on the coffee table, screen down, and went back to folding socks. The lawn week couldn't take long. The silence afterward was enormous. On Sunday, she went to her sister Rachel's place for dinner, as she did most Sundays. Rachel lived in a 2-bedroom walk-up in Astoria with her husband, Ben, and their 6-year-old daughter, Lily. The apartment always smelled like garlic and something slightly burnt, and the TV was always on in the background, and Lily always tried to feed Nora her broccoli. "You're quiet tonight," Rachel said, sliding a plate of pasta across the kitchen counter. She was 3 years older than Nora, with the same dark hair but sharper eyes. She missed nothing. "Just tired," Nora said, twirling spaghetti around her fork. "You said that last week too." Rachel leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "And the week before. You've been saying that for a month." "Maybe I'm just tired for a month." Rachel did not sound convinced. She picked up Lily's juice cup and refilled it, then lowered her voice. "Is it Maya? Did she call?" Nora shook her head. "She texted. Friday. And I didn't answer." Rachel raised an eyebrow. She waited a beat, then said, "That's new." "Is it? For you?" Rachel sat down across from her, propping her chin on her hand. "Nora, you usually fold like a lawn chair the second she so much as looks at you. Not answering a text for 2 days? That's practically a revolution." Nora poked at her pasta. She didn't know how to explain it. That the silence didn't feel like denial. Exactly. It felt like self-preservation. Like she was standing at the edge of a high dive, not sure if she wanted to jump. "I've been seeing a therapist," she said, because it was true and it was easier than explaining the rest. Rachel's face softened. "Oh, honey, good for you. Is it helping?" "I think so." Nora paused. "She's good. She asks things I don't like to think about." "That's what they're supposed to do." Rachel reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I'm proud of you, for doing the work." Nora smiled, and it felt almost real. Then Lily came running in, demanding to show her aunt the painting she made of a cat with 8 legs, and the moment passed.
But something in Rachel's words stayed with her, warm and steady. On Tuesday, she walked into the office at 4:58 p.m., 2 coffees in hand. She had told herself she wasn't going to do it this time. It was a one-time thing, a fluke, a moment of caffeine-based insanity. But then she'd walked past the coffee cart and her feet had moved on their own. And now here she was, holding 1 black coffee and 1 oat milk latte, the same as before. Dr. Hart's door was open. She was at her desk reading something, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. She looked up when Nora knocked, and for a moment something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, or recognition, or something Nora couldn't quite name. "You brought coffee again," Dr. Hart said. It wasn't a question. "I was getting one for myself," Nora said, the lie rehearsed and ready. "And I remembered you said you liked the oat milk one, so I figured. 2 cups is barely more effort than 1, you know." Dr. Hart set down her pen. She looked at the cup Nora was holding out, then at Nora's face. "That's very thoughtful, Nora." There it was again. That word. It landed in Nora's chest like a stone in still water, sending ripples she didn't know what to do with. She set the cup down on the edge of the desk, a little too quickly, and took her usual seat. The session began the way it always did, with Dr. Hart asking how her week had been. Nora talked about the text for the Mia, about not answering, about Rachel's comment, that the silence felt like a revolution. Dr. Hart listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap. When Nora fell quiet, Dr. Hart said, "It sounds like you're learning to pause before you respond to Maya. That's significant. What made that possible?" Nora blinked. She opened her mouth to say, "I don't know." But what came out was, "I think I'm tired of being the one who always gives." Dr. Hart leaned forward slightly. "Tell me more about that." And Nora did. She talked about how she'd always been the one to apologize first, to smooth things over, to buy the coffee and the flowers and the forgiveness. How she'd learned early that being easy to love meant being easy to have around. How she'd told herself that was a strength. But lately, it felt like a cage. When she finished, she was breathing harder than she expected. Dr. Hart was watching her with that steady, unhurried gaze. "Nora," Dr. Hart said, "I want you to notice something. You just described a pattern of giving without expecting anything back. And yet, this week, you brought me coffee again. I'm not asking you to explain that. I'm just asking you to notice it." Nora's cheeks went warm. She opened her mouth to say it was nothing, just a habit, just politeness. But the words stuck. When the session ended, she walked out without looking back. The coffee cup sat on the edge of Dr. Hart's desk, still full, the lid still on. Dr. Hart did not throw it away. She left it there, on the corner of her desk, all through the next appointment and the one after that, until the oat milk went stale and the cardboard softened. She told herself she would throw it away eventually. She didn't. Nora, meanwhile, walked all the way home, and for the first time in days she did think that not Maya's text. She thought about a question she still didn't know how to answer, and a truth she wasn't ready to face, and the way Dr. Hart had said her name soft and careful like it mattered. The next Tuesday, Nora walked into Dr. Hart's office and noticed the coffee cup was gone. Not thrown away exactly. She couldn't have said how she knew, but the spot on the corner of the desk felt wrong. Too clean. The mug she had brought last time, the one with the chipped blue rim, now sat on the windowsill, rinsed and drying on a paper towel. She didn't ask. She sat down in her usual chair, crossed her ankles, and waited. Dr. Hart settled across from her, pen in hand but not yet touching the paper. She was wearing a gray sweater, sleeves pushed to her elbows. Her hair was pulled back, one piece falling loose near her temple. She looked at Nora for a long moment before she spoke. "You went quiet when I mentioned the coffee last week," she said. "I want to come back to that." Nora pressed her fingers into her thighs. "I didn't think it meant anything." "Maybe it didn't, but the way you reacted told me something." Dr. Hart leaned forward slightly, and her voice went softer, the way it did when she was about to ask something careful. "Can you remember the first time you learned that giving things to people made them like you more?"
The question hit like a cold glass of water to the chest. Nora blinked. That's specific. Sometimes specific questions get us somewhere faster than open ones. Nora looked at the window. The cup was still there, upside down on the paper towel, waiting to be put away. She thought about her mother's kitchen, the way the light came through the yellow curtains, the sound of her father clearing his throat before he said something that would start a fight. "I was 8, she said slowly. My parents were going through a rough patch. My dad would come home late, and my mom would cry in the bathroom, and I would hear her through the door, trying to be quiet about it." She swallowed. "I figured out that if I made her tea, she stopped crying. Not right away, but she would come out and she would look at me, and I could tell she was trying to be okay for me. So I made tea every night, even when she didn't ask for it." Dr. Hart wrote something down. The scratch of the pen was the only sound in the room. "Did anyone ask you to do that?" she said. "No. But it worked." It worked for her. Nora felt something twist in her chest. It worked for both of us. She was happier. I got to feel like I mattered. And what did it cost you? The question sat there, patient and terrible. Nora opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I don't know." "Take your time." Nora looked down at her hands. Her knuckles were pale, pressed together in her lap. I think I stopped asking for things. Because if I was the one giving, I didn't have to risk being told no. I didn't have to find out if I was worth saying yes to. The words came out quieter than she expected. They hung in the air, raw and unpolished, and for the first time, Nora did not try to fix them with a joke or a shrug. Dr. Hart set her pen down. Without it, her hands looked uncertain, 2 pale birds folded on her knee. "That makes sense," she said. "You built a survival strategy when you were 8 years old. It kept you safe. It gave you a way to feel connected. But it also told you that love was something you had to earn." Nora's eyes burned. She blinked hard. "I'm doing it now, aren't I?" "With everyone. With Maya." "With everyone," Dr. Hart confirmed. Paused. "With me." The room went very still. Nora looked up at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Dr. Hart's gaze was steady, but her hands had moved, one of them pressed flat against her knee as if holding herself in place. She did not look away. "I brought you coffee because I wanted you to think I was a good patient," Nora said, her voice thin. "I wanted you to like me." "I did like you," Dr. Hart said. "You walked in my office 3 weeks ago, sat down and told me the truth about your breakup while your voice was shaking. I didn't need coffee to know you were worth saying yes to. You were worth that on the first day." Nora felt the tears come before she could stop them. She turned her face away, pressing the heels of her palms against her eyes. "I'm sorry. This is so embarrassing." "It's not embarrassing. It's honest. I'm crying in front of my therapist." "You're crying in a room where you're allowed to cry. That's the entire point of this room." Nora let out a shaky half-laugh, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand. When she looked back, Dr. Hart was still watching her, and there was something in her expression that Nora couldn't name. It wasn't clinical. It wasn't distant. It looked almost like tenderness, held carefully behind a professional mask. "Nora." Dr. Hart's voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "You don't have to earn this." Nora's breath caught. She didn't know what "this" meant, or if she was allowed to ask. The words landed somewhere deep, in that locked place she had been protecting since she was 8 years old, and they settled there like a key that fit. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was warm, the way a room feels when someone has just turned the heat on. The session ended 5 minutes later. On schedule, Dr. Hart walking her to the door and holding it open with one hand. Nora stepped into the hallway and turned back, about to say thank you, about to say something that would fix the moment and make it normal, but Dr. Hart spoke first. "Same time next week?" "Yeah." Nora nodded. "Same time." She was halfway down the stairs when her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She pulled it out, still blinking against the brightness of the afternoon sun. "Maya, did I do something wrong?"
You haven't answered. I just want to talk. Nora stood on the steps of the building, the phone warm in her hand, and she thought about Dr. Hart's voice, the way she had said Nora's name like it was something precious. She thought about the coffee cup on the windowsill, rinsed and waiting. She did not answer Maya's text. She put the phone back in her pocket and kept walking. The week after that session, Nora tried something she had never done before. She said no. It started small. Her coworker asked her to cover a Friday shift she had not asked for. Nora heard herself say, "I can't this week." The words felt foreign in her mouth, like a borrowed coat that did not quite fit across the shoulders. Her coworker blinked, shrugged, and moved on. The world did not end. She told herself it was a victory. She told herself this was what Dr. Hart meant. But on Tuesday night, sitting alone in her apartment with a bowl of cold noodles, she felt something hollow in her chest. If she was not the person who gave, who was she? The question sat with her patient and unkind, while the noodles went soft in the broth. She did not reply to Maya's messages. There were 3 now, stacked like small accusations. The third one said, "I'm starting to get worried about you." Nora read it twice and felt the familiar pull. Durs to respond, to reassure, to smooth the water. She put the phone face down on the counter and walked away. Her hands found her phone again an hour later, not to text Maya. She opened the clinic's appointment portal and looked at her next session date, 4 days away. She closed the app, opened it again. The number of days did not change. On the day of her 5th session, Nora arrived early. She sat in the waiting room with a magazine she was not reading, watching the door like it might tell her something about herself. When Dr. Hart appeared in the doorway, Nora noticed the small things first. The way her blouse was a different shade of gray, the way her hair was slightly damp at the edges, like she had just washed it. Like she had thought about this day too. "Come in," Dr. Hart said, and Nora felt the words land somewhere soft and dangerous. They sat across from each other. The coffee cup was on the windowsill again, in a slightly different position, closer to the edge, as if someone had picked it up, held it, and put it down without thinking. "I said no to something this week," Nora said, before Dr. Hart could ask. Dr. Hart's eyebrows lifted a fraction. "How did it feel?" "Terrifying." Nora laughed, a short, dry sound, but also, I don't know, light? Like I had been carrying something I didn't realize I was holding. "That's a big step." Dr. Hart's voice was careful, measured. "But I'm curious. When you said no, did you feel like yourself, or did you feel like someone else?" Nora considered the question. The noodles, the hollow feeling. The way saying no had made her feel neither free nor guilty, but something worse. Unknown to herself. "Like someone else," she admitted. "Like I was wearing a costume. But maybe the costume is the problem. Maybe I've been wearing Think lock. So long I forgot what I look like without it." Dr. Hart leaned forward slightly. The pen was in her hand, then on the armrest. "What do you think you look like without it?" The question hung between them, soft and devastating. Nora looked at the coffee cup on the windowsill. She thought about the way her mother had looked at her when she was 8 years old, the way her small hands had learned to hold a tea tray steady. She thought about Maya's messages, waiting like small traps. "I don't know," she said finally. "I'm afraid I'll look like nothing." Dr. Hart was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer than Nora had ever heard it. "You don't look like nothing to me." Nora's chest tightened. She wanted to ask what she looked like. She wanted to ask what Dr. Hart saw when she looked at her. The questions pressed against her teeth, but she swallowed them down. Good patients didn't ask those questions. Good patients stayed in their lane. Instead, she said, "Maya keeps texting me. She says she's worried." Dr. Hart's expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted, a stillness that was louder than movement. "And what do you feel when you read her messages?" "Guilt, like I'm the one who did something wrong." Nora's voice cracked. "She's making me feel like I'm the problem for not responding to her. And the weird thing is, I know that's not true. I know she's the one who left. But I still feel like I owe her an answer." "You don't owe her anything." Dr. Hart said it plainly, without force.
You owe yourself the space to figure out what you want without her pulling on you. Nora looked down at her hands. But what if I don't know what I want? That's okay. Dr. Hart's voice was almost gentle. That's what this room is for, to figure it out,
without anyone else telling you who you're supposed to be. The words settled over Nora like a blanket she did not know she needed. She looked up and met Dr. Hart's eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that felt like being seen. "Can I ask you something?" Nora said, before she could stop herself. Dr. Hart nodded. "Do you ever think about your patients outside of this room?" The question landed with more weight than Nora intended. Dr. Hart's fingers stilled on the armrest. For a long, stretched second, she said nothing. Then she picked up the pen, clicked it once, and set it down. "Sometimes," she said, "when they stay with me." Nora's heart knocked against her ribs. She did not know what to do with the answer, so she did what she always did. She tucked it away, somewhere safe, somewhere she could think about it later when she was alone. When the session ended, Dr. Hart walked her to the door, as always, but this time her hand brushed Nora's elbow as she reached for the handle. Brief, incidental, electric. Nora felt it through the fabric of her sleeve. "Same time next week?" Dr. Hart asked. Nora nodded. She could not find her voice. She was halfway down the stairs when she realized her phone had buzzed again. She pulled it out, expecting another message from Maya. Instead, the notification read, "You have a new appointment reminder." She opened it and saw the date. Then she saw the second line, the one she had never noticed before. The reminder was signed with a name she had never seen used before, only written on a door plaque. Dr. V. Hart. She stood on the stairs, the phone glowing in her hand, and she thought about Dr. Hart's hand on her elbow, the brief electric pressure, the way she had said summity, V-teens. She put the phone in her pocket and kept walking, but the feeling stayed with her all the way home. The bus was warm and nearly empty. Nora found a seat by the window and let her head rest against the cool glass. The city slid past in streaks of amber streetlight and neon, but she was not seeing any of it. She was still on the stairs of Dr. Hart's building, still feeling the ghost of that hand on her elbow. She replayed the sentence in her head for the 12th time sometimes. She had asked if Dr. Hart ever thought about her patients outside the office, and Dr. Hart had said, "sometimes." Not a deflection, not a clinical pivot, just the word, delivered in that low, measured voice with a pause that felt like it had been weighed on a scale. Nora turned the word over like a coin in her palm. She did not know what to do with it. The responsible interpretation was that Dr. Hart thought about all her patients sometimes, the way any good therapist would. That was the professional reading. That was the safe reading. But the other reading, the one Nora kept circling back to, was that Dr. Hart had looked at her for a long moment before answering, that her voice had dropped half a register, that her hand had found Nora's elbow with a certainty that did not feel like accident. The bus lurched around a corner, and Nora's phone slid across the seat beside her. She picked it up out of habit. Maya's 3 messages were still there, at the top of the thread, unread. The last one had been sitting there for 2 days now. "I'm starting to get worried about you." Nora stared at it for a long time. She felt the familiar pull of obligation, the old reflex that said, reply, explain, smooth it over. But she also felt something else now, a quieter thing. She did not want to explain. She did not want to smooth it over. She put the phone back down on the seat, face down. At home, the apartment was dark and quiet. Her mother was already in bed, the door to her room closed with a sliver of light underneath. Nora microwaved a bowl of leftover soup and sat at the small kitchen table, eating slowly. The spoon clinked against the ceramic bowl. The radiator hummed. She felt the strange hollow of the evening stretch out around her. Her phone buzzed. Not Maya. It was her mother's voice from behind the closed door, calling out something about a package that had been left in the hallway. Nora got up, retrieved the box from outside, and set it on the kitchen counter. It was addressed to her mother. The return label was from a catalog company Nora had never heard of. She carried the box to her mother's door and knocked softly. "I brought the package in." "Open it for me, sweetheart," her mother said through the door. "My hands are sore tonight." Nora stood there with the box in her hands. She could feel the shape of the request, familiar as her own heartbeat. Open it, handle it, fix it. The pattern was so old she wore it like a second skin. But tonight, something in her chest pushed back. She thought about the conversation in Dr. Hart's office, the one about what it meant to say no. She thought about how strange it had felt to refuse Frank's shift request, how strange it still felt days later. But she had done it. And the world had not ended. "Mom," she said, her voice quieter than she meant it to be. "Could you open it yourself? I'm kind of in the middle of dinner." There was a pause. The sliver of light under the door did not move. Then her mother said, "Oh, all right." The words were flat, not hurt exactly, but not warm either. Nora stood there for another moment, the blunt saw still in her hands, and she felt the weight of the word no settle into the space between them. She set the box down on the floor just outside the door and walked back to the kitchen. Her soup had gone lukewarm. She ate it anyway. She was washing the bowl when her phone buzzed again. She dried her hands and looked at the screen. It was not Maya. It was a notification from the clinic's patient portal. "Reminder, your next appointment with Dr. V. Hart is in 4 days." She read the name again. Dr. V. Hart. She had never thought about what the V stood for. She'd only ever seen the full name on the door plaque in that serif font that felt formal and distant. But seeing it on her phone, on a message meant for her eyes only, felt different, intimate almost, like a signature on a letter. She put the phone down and finished the dishes. The kitchen was quiet except for the drip of the faucet and the hum of the refrigerator. She caught herself smiling at the sink, a small private thing, and she did not try to stop it. That night, she lay in bed with the lights off, the ceiling a pale gray above her. She thought about the way Dr. Hart had said sometimes, the way her hand had found Nora's elbow, the way she had said, "Same time next week," like it mattered. Nora turned onto her side and pulled the blanket up to her chin. She did not try to interpret any of it. She just let the feeling sit in her chest, warm and unexamined, and she fell asleep with it still there. The 6th session arrived on a Tuesday that felt heavier than the others. Nora had been to weekend ignoring Maya's calls, watching them light up her screen and disappear into voicemail. She told herself she was practicing boundaries. She did not tell herself that she was saving her voice for someone else. She arrived at the office building 20 minutes early and sat in the coffee shop across the street, nursing a latte she did not really want. Through the window, she watched people come and go, briefcases and strollers and dogs on leashes, normal people with normal Tuesdays. She wondered if any of them were also trying to figure out whether their therapist had meant something by the way they said sometimes. At exactly 2:58, she walked up the stairs. The door to the office was already open, and Dr. Hart was standing by the window with a mug in her hand, her silhouette soft against the afternoon light. She had on a gray sweater today, the sleeves pushed up to her forearms, and her hair was loose, falling past her shoulders in a way that made Nora's chest tighten for no reason she could name. "You're early," Dr. Hart said, turning. She smiled, small and genuine. "I was just finishing my tea. Come in." Nora sat in her usual chair and watched Dr. Hart settle into the armchair across from her. The office smelled like coffee and the faint floral note of the hand cream on the desk. The same plant in the corner, the same stack of books on the shelf. But today Nora noticed something new. A small, framed photograph on the desk, angled toward the window so she had never seen it before. She could just make out the shape of 2 figures, but she could not tell who they were. "Have you had a chance to practice what we talked about?" Dr. Hart asked. "Yes," Nora said. "I think so." "Tell me about it." Nora wrapped her fingers around the edge of her knee. "I said no to my mom last week. She wanted me to unpack some boxes in the garage, and I told her I could not do it that day." "How did that feel?" "Strange," Nora admitted. "It felt like I was holding something heavy. Like the word no had actual weight. That is a real thing," Dr. Hart said. "Saying no often feels heavier than saying yes, especially when you are not used to it. The weight you feel is the cost of changing a pattern. It does not mean you did something wrong." Nora nodded slowly.
She wanted to ask Dr. Hart if she ever felt that weight, if she ever said no and felt the world tilt. But the question felt too personal, too close to the line she was trying not to cross. Instead, she said, "Maya keeps calling. I have not answered." "That sounds like a boundary too." "It does not feel like one," Nora said. "It feels like I am hiding." Dr. Hart tilted her head slightly, studying her. "What do you think the difference is between hiding and protecting yourself?" Nora opened her mouth and closed it. The question sat between them, patient and open, and she realized she did not have an answer. She had spent so long trying to be good, to be agreeable, to be the person everyone could rely on. She'd never stopped to ask herself what she actually wanted. "I do not know," she said finally. "I have never thought about it." "That might be worth thinking about," Dr. Hart said softly. "Not today, necessarily, but sometime." There it was again, sometime. The word landed in Nora's chest like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples outward. She watched Dr. Hart's face for any sign that she had said it on purpose, but Dr. Hart was already reaching for her mug, her expression calm and professional. Nora's phone buzzed in her bag. She ignored it, but it buzzed again, and again. 3 times in quick succession, urgent and insistent. Dr. Hart glanced at the bag. "Do you need to check that?" "It is just Maya," Nora said. "Are you sure?" The buzzes stopped, then started again. Nora pulled the phone out with thinking, and saw the screen fill with message after message, scrolling past like a ticker tape. "Where are you?" "I am outside your apartment. I have been waiting for an hour. Please just talk to me." "I am not going away." Her stomach dropped. She looked up at Dr. Hart, and for a moment, the office felt very small and very quiet. "I think," Nora said slowly, "I need to go." Dr. Hart set her mug down. "Is everything all right?" "I do not know yet." She stood, shoving the phone back into her bag. Dr. Hart rose too, and for a second they were close, closer than they had ever been without the buffer of the armchair. Nora could smell the coffee on Dr. Hart's breath, and something else, something clean and warm like laundry fresh from the dryer. "If you need to talk," Dr. Hart said quietly, "you can call the office. Or come by, the door is usually open." Nora looked at her. There was something in Dr. Hart's eyes that she had not seen before, something unguarded and slightly worried, and it made her chest ache in a way she could not explain. "Thank you," she said. Then she turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind her. The stairwell was dim and cold. She pulled out her phone and looked at Maya's messages again. The last one read, "I am not leaving until you come home." Nora stood at the bottom of the stairs for a long moment, her hand on the door, her heart beating hard. She thought about Dr. Hart's face, the worry in her eyes, the way she had said, "The door is usually open." She thought about Maya waiting outside her apartment, patient and determined, a reminder of everything she was trying to leave behind. She pushed the door open and stepped out into the afternoon light. The street was busy, full of people who did not know her name or her heart. She started walking, no thing toward home, but away from it, her feet carrying her in no particular direction. Her phone buzzed again. She turned it off and kept walking. She walked for 40 minutes without looking up. The city blurred around her, storefronts and crosswalks and other people's lives, all of it distant and irrelevant. Her feet ached in shoes that were not made for walking, but she did not stop. Stopping meant thinking. Thinking meant feeling, and feeling was the one thing she had spent 6 months learning how to avoid. By the time she finally slowed down, she had reached the edge of the park, the one with the old fountain that had been dry since spring. She sat on the bench facing it, her hands empty, her phone dead in her pocket. The afternoon light had begun to soften, turning gold at the edges. She watched a father lift his daughter onto his shoulders, the girl's laughter carrying across the grass. Something in her chest tightened. She thought about her mother, the way she had not responded when Nora said she did not want to unpack the boxes. She thought about Maya, sitting on the steps of her apartment building, waiting with the patience of someone who had never once doubted she would come back. She thought about Dr. Hart, the way her sleeve had been pushed up, the way she had said the door is usually open, the way her eyes had looked almost afraid. Nora had never been good at knowing what she wanted. She had always let other people decide, other people push, other people leave. She had built her life around being wanted, not wanting.
And now, for the first time, she was standing in the middle of her own life, with no one telling her where to go. She pressed her palms against her eyes and sat like that for a long time. When she finally stood, she did not walk toward home. She leaped back the way she had come, past the coffee shop, past the corner where she had stood that first day with her hands shaking, past the stairwell that led up to the office with the door that was always open. The waiting room was empty, the receptionist had gone home, the lights were dim, and the door to Dr. Hart's office was open, spilling warm light into the hallway. Vivienne Hart looked up from her desk. She was still wearing the gray sweater, the sleeves still pushed up, her hair still loose around her face. She did not look surprised to see Nora standing there. She only set down her pen and waited. "I didn't know where else to go," Nora said. Her voice came out raw, scraped clean of pretense. "Come in," Dr. Hart said. "Close the door if you want, or leave it open. It's your choice." Nora stepped inside and closed the door behind her. She stood in the middle of the office, her hands hanging at her sides, suddenly aware of how much of herself she had been carrying alone. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the building. She looked at the desk, and for the first time she was close enough to see the photograph in the frame. Two figures, blurred at the edges, caught mid-laugh at some outdoor gathering. One was clearly Vivienne, younger, her hair shorter, her smile unguarded. The other was a woman with dark curls and round glasses, her head tilted toward Vivienne as if they were sharing a secret. They were holding hands. "My sister," Dr. Hart said quietly. "Her name was Grace. She died 8 years ago. Car accident. She was the only family I had left." Nora's breath caught. She looked at Dr. Hart, at the careful composure that had never once cracked in 6 months of sessions, and she saw something she had never seen before. Grief. Not the polished,
Vilsion, the real thing, raw and unhealed, sitting just beneath the surface. "I don't tell most of my clients about her," Dr. Hart continued. "I don't tell anyone, really, but I thought you should know, because when you sat in that chair 6 months ago and told me you were afraid of being alone, I understood. I have been alone in ways you haven't imagined. And I have also learned that being alone is not the same as being empty." Nora felt the tears before she heard the sob. They came up from somewhere deep and old, a grief she had been carrying for years without a name. She pressed her hand to her mouth, but it did not stop. She had never cried in front of Dr. Hart, not once, not even in the worst sessions. Vivienne stood and walked around the desk. She did not reach out, did not touch, did not offer the kind of comfort that came with conditions. She simply stood close. Close enough that Nora could feel the warmth of her. Close enough to know she was not alone. "I'm sorry," Nora managed, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to—" "Don't apologize," Vivienne said. Her voice was low and steady. "You don't have to be strong in here. You never did. I just needed you to be ready to let me see you." Nora looked up at her, through the blur of tears, and for the first time she saw Vivienne Hart, not as her therapist, not as the composed woman behind the desk, but as a person. A person who had lost someone and kept living. A person who had opened her door, over and over, without ever asking for anything in return. "I've been hiding," Nora said. "From Maya, from my mother, from everyone. But I think mostly I've been hiding from myself." "Yes," Vivienne said. "I know. What do I do now?" Vivienne was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You go home. You face her. Not because
Coaching in Suffin to develop. Thinks that you owe her anything, but because you owe yourself the truth. And then you come back here and we figure out what comes next. But Nora," she paused and her voice softened, "you don't have to do it alone. Not anymore." Nora wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked at the photograph again, at Grace, at the sister who had been loved and lost. She looked at Vivienne, standing close enough to touch, not touching, giving her the space to choose. "Thank you," Nora whispered. Vivienne smiled. It was a small thing, barely a curve of her lips, but it reached her eyes. "The door is always open," she said. "I meant it then. I mean it now." Nora walked out of the office and down the stairs, her steps steadier than they had been in months. The sun was lower now, the streets painted in amber. She did not turn her phone on until she reached the corner. When she did, the messages flooded in, Maya's name lighting up the screen over and over. She read the last one. I am still here. I am not leaving. Nora took a breath. Then she typed a single line and pressed send. I'm coming home. We need to talk. The apartment building looked the same as it always did, but Nora felt like she was seeing it for the first time. The cracked pavement by the steps, the flickering porch light, the way the door stuck just slightly when you pushed it. She had lived here for 2 years, and she had never noticed any of it. Maya was sitting on the top step, her knees pulled to her chest, her phone clutched in both hands. She looked up when Nora approached, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. You came back, Maya said. Her voice was hoarse, like she had been talking for hours, or maybe crying. I said I would, Nora replied. She stopped a few feet away, not sitting down, not moving closer.
Was the part she had been practicing in her head for 3 blocks. The words felt clumsy, but she said them anyway. I need you to listen, Maya, not interrupt. Just listen. Maya nodded slowly, her eyes searching Nora's face for something familiar. Nora took a breath. I'm not coming back to you. I'm not coming back to us. I thought if I said it loud enough or waited long enough, I would start to want it again. But that's not how it works. I can't fill a hole in myself with someone else's love. I tried that with you, and it wasn't fair to either of us. The words hung in the air, raw and unpolished. Maya's lips parted, then closed. She looked down at her hands, and Nora saw her shoulders drop like she had been holding something heavy for a very long time. I knew, Maya said quietly. I think I knew for months, I just didn't want to be alone. Neither did I, Nora said. She finally sat down on the step, keeping a careful distance. That's the part I couldn't admit. I was using you to avoid being alone, and you were using me to avoid facing whatever was hurting you. That's not a relationship. That's 2 people holding each other down. Maya laughed, a sad, broken sound. When did you get so smart? Therapy, Nora said, and she smiled a little. Turns out talking to someone who actually listens changes a lot. They sat in silence for a minute, the way 2 people do when they have stopped fighting. The porch light flickered overhead, and somewhere inside the building, someone's television played a laugh track. I'm sorry, Maya said finally, for the texts, for showing up here. I was scared and I didn't know how to say that. I know, Nora said. I'm sorry too. For staying when I knew I wanted to leave, that was cruel in its own way. Maya wiped her eyes with the like of her hand. So what happens now? Nora looked out at the street, at the cars passing, at the neighbor walking her dog, at the ordinary world continuing to turn. We stop pretending. We figure out who we are without each other. And maybe, eventually, we become people who can say hello without it hurting. That sounds like a lot of work, Maya said. It is, Nora said. But I'm done running from it. Maya stood up, brushing off her jeans. She looked at Nora for a long moment, then nodded once. Okay, I'll go. But if you ever need to talk, not as us, just as 2 people who used to know each other, my number is the same. Nora stood up too, and for a moment they just looked at each other. There was no anger left, no desperate clinging, just 2 women who had once loved each other badly, now learning to let go gently. Take care of yourself, Nora, Maya said. You too, Nora replied. Maya walked down the steps and toward her car without looking back. Nora watched her go until the taillights disappeared around the corner. Then she walked into her apartment, closed the door, and leaned against it, letting the silence wash over her. It was the first time in months that the silence didn't feel like something to escape. The next afternoon, Nora sat in the familiar chair across from Dr. Hart. The office was the same, the light the same, the box of tissues in the same place on the side table. But something had shifted. Nora felt it in the way she sat, her shoulders back, her hands relaxed in her lap. I did it, she said. I talked to Maya. I told her the truth. Dr. Hart inclined her head,
a gentle curiosity in her expression. How did that feel? Terrifying, Nora admitted. And then, after she left, I felt this
quiet, like I had been holding my breath for a year and finally let it out. Dr. Hart smiled. That quiet is the sound of a boundary holding. It takes courage to build one, and even more courage to sit inside it without panicking. Nora looked at her. At the woman who had seen her at her worst, who had held the door open when everything in Nora had wanted to run. She thought about the photograph on the desk, about Grace, about the sister who was still loved every day. "Can I ask you something?" Nora said. "Of course. The door you keep talking about, is it just for patients, or is it for you too?" The question hung in the air between them. Dr. Hart looked at her for a long moment, and Nora saw something flicker in her eyes, something careful and honest. "That's a good question," Dr. Hart said softly. "I'm still learning how to answer it." Nora nodded. "Then I'll wait. I'm getting better at that." Dr. Hart's smile widened, just a fraction, and Nora felt something warm settle in her chest. Not a certainty, not a promise, just the quiet knowledge that she was no longer walking through the world alone. 3 weeks later, Nora stood in the park where she had once felt so lost. The trees had started to turn, the leaves edged in gold. She held a cup of coffee in one hand and her phone in the other, staring at the unsent message. Her finger hovered over the keyboard. Then she typed a single line. "There's a new bakery on King Street. I don't know if you like scones, but I thought maybe you'd want to find out with me. Saturday, 10 a.m. No pressure, just an open door." She stared at the message for a long moment, her heart tapping against her ribs. Then she pressed send, slipped the phone into her pocket, and took a sip of her coffee. The sun was warm on her face. The city hummed what
piled around her, ordinary and alive. For the first time in her life, Nora wasn't waiting for someone else to tell her what she wanted. She was simply standing in the middle of her own life, with the door wide open, ready to walk through it.
And just like that, I closed one door, only to see what happens when another one opens. Sometimes, the best plot twists happen when you finally set a boundary. Thanks for letting me share my story with you today. Where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments below.